Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy that we get to start the conference here on the sexiest topic there is, content. I know you're all very excited. It may not be sexy, but it is of critical import to make sure the things we're building are actually useful for the people we're building them for. So I want to start out by introducing you to this incredible panel, all of who are in black, so you might not be able to see us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicole Braddock. I own a company called Theory and Principle. We are a software design and development shop that just works in the legal space. So we do a lot of larger justice products, from soup to nuts, all the way from design through development through launch. So a lot of the perspectives I'll be giving you are from the perspective of a development team that you might be working with as you're building your technology. I'll pass it on.
Hi folks, I'm Erica Rickard. I'm from the Pew Charitable Trusts and formerly at the Harvard Access to Justice Lab. Shout out to my friend Matthew back there. And the Massachusetts Trial Court.
Matthew's wearing a tie.
Looking sharp, Matthew. Hey, my name is Hallie J. Pope. I am the president and founder of the Graphic Advocacy Project. We are a teeny tiny nonprofit that uses visual communication tools like comics, cartoons, animations, graphic design to explain legal concepts and advance social justice.
And hi, my name is Jay Singleton. I'm the program manager at Minnesota Legal Services State Support. We work with the Coalition of Legal Aid Programs in Minnesota, and our office runs and maintains lawhelpmn.org, which is Minnesota's statewide portal for legal information and referrals.
All right, so you've got the person who runs a statewide legal assistance portal, you've got a legal cartoonist, and a legal software design and development company owner, and me. And so what I'm here to talk about is, I'll get us started to kind of describe a little bit of what the landscape is of what we're going to be going over today, which is, here's all of us. And first we're going to talk a little bit about content strategy, and what I'll be gleaning from is actually from having worked with these folks and also with other folks in similar veins, and kind of trying to distill some of the main lessons that I've learned from leaders like these guys, and then hope to turn it over to you folks to provide some additional background information as we go through. So we'll be talking about content strategy, both the what of your content and the how. We'll talk about content design, visualization, content writing, especially plain language writing for our target audiences. And then we'll come back around to me to talk about content assessment. So this is your chance. If this is not what you were expecting to learn about today, I will not be sad if you feel like you need to leave. Okay, so first the content strategy. I'll talk a little bit about the what of your content strategy, and then I'll turn it over to Nicole to talk about the how. So first maybe we should talk about, all right, I'm really gonna throw the camera guy off. Okay, first we're gonna talk about like what kinds of content do we mean? We're going to use the word content, I think, 3,000 times in the course of this presentation. So let's get started like right now with an idea about like what kinds of content are you all thinking about, and what kinds of content do we mean? So I'm going to ask people to just shout out what kinds of content. When you saw the word content on this panel, what were you thinking of? Anybody? Stacy? Anyway. Website. Okay. Legal information broadly. Videos. Self-help guides. Anything you want to communicate. I like that one. So what we're talking about is a really, really broad idea. Most of the examples that we're going to be drawing from are either web-based or print-based information. But the idea is we're going to be talking about the universe, including multimedia universe of information that you're hoping to convey and you're hoping people will be able to use and act on. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about content. Now, when we're talking about the strategy, this is the part that some of this is going to seem intuitive, but it's really striking how few people actually start with a proactive approach to what they're doing with their content. So I'm not going to ask people to show hands because this might be embarrassing, but how many people have put up information on their website because they had it and they just needed some place to fill their website, right? Oh, we got a couple of brave hands raised. Okay. How many people felt like they needed to put up some information on their website because they had a grant that said that they had to? All right, we got a couple of those. And maybe even more, like how many people had other kinds of content, maybe a guided interview or a video that someone else told you was probably a good idea to put up, and that's why you have it up. All right, that seems like roughly everybody. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about is actually some of the more strategic approaches that people are starting to take when deciding what content to put up and how to maintain it. So I'm going to come up here awkwardly. And this is actually an exercise that I hope that you guys can do right now, and then we're going to talk about with a neighbor. So think about really briefly. So I want you to think about one specific piece of content, maybe the content that you came into this room thinking about, whether it was part of your website, a specific interview that you're creating, a video that you think would be awesome but you haven't made yet, and identify what the goals are of that content. So what did you want somebody to get out of it? Did you want someone to learn about their rights? Did you want someone to write a nasty letter to their landlord? What was the goal of the content? And if you haven't created it yet, this is an opportunity to think big. For that goal, who is the actual target audience? Who do you actually intend that information to be reaching, and what that is going to actually be acting on that information? Okay, so you've got your goal, you've got your target audience. Okay, I want you to turn to somebody next to you and talk a little bit about what it was that you decided your goal was and what your target audience was. And you can introduce yourself and say your name too while you're at it, that's fine. So who had one that they're just burning to share? An interesting goal of their content, an interesting target audience. Yeah, somebody over there? No, you change your mind? Yeah, go for it. All right, so just to repeat for the video, that people who have been served with divorce papers and they're like, that's the target audience, and the goal is to connect them with unbundled legal services. Another one right here. So the target audience in this example is new staff who need to learn about, what was the legal issue? Private landlord-tenant issues, so that they can actually overcome rural barriers or geographic barriers to actually being able to help more people. And one more, yeah. All right, so this one is people who are being harassed by debt collectors, and I want to press a little bit more on that. Like, what is the goal of the information that you're conveying? Okay, so to inform people of their rights. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this one later on, because I think being able to understand and then assess what the intended impact is, we might want to drill down a little bit more and be a little bit more precise with exactly what outcome we hope to achieve with the kind of information that we're creating. So once you've identified this target audience, so we've got either consumers or new attorneys or people who've been served with divorce papers, and we have a goal that we're intending to reach, to achieve, there's a whole host, as we talked about at the very, very beginning, there's a whole host of different kinds of content, different kinds of formats, different kinds of channels for delivering that information that we're going to go over in more detail, all three of my co-panelists up here. And then after they go through that, we'll come back to me and I'll talk about how we can assess whether that happens. But the key, once we do identifying our goals and identifying the ways in which we're going to convey information, is to assess whether we're achieving those goals and then to kind of reevaluate. So maybe you're learning that the information that you're providing isn't reaching your target audience, it's reaching a whole other audience. That might actually affect the starting point of what your goals are and who that target audience is. So this is an iterative process, and it's really important that this be something that is maintained over time. And we're going to talk about why you should keep that information fresh, but first I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to talk about how.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, so I think when we think about content, we really have substantive content, and then we have logistical issues around content. And I just want to speak for a brief moment about the logistics of content, because it's one of the very first discussions we have with our clients when we start on a new development project, because it's one of the most often overlooked and parts of a project, and it's one of the things that causes the most delay in the launch of a project. So tips from our perspective as a development team. As a team, you will need to identify who's going to be creating the content at the outset. This can be one person, this can be more than one person. You can have one person who's creating, if there's blog-style content, and another person who's deciding, this is what the landing page should say, this is sort of what the buttons need to say, this is what the sort of all the other components of the application are going to say, but you need to identify that person. And one of the challenges that we often have when we're working in the nonprofit sector is that we're often relying on volunteer lawyers. And volunteer lawyers don't have time, and they're very bad at writing web content, as I'm sure my co-panelists will talk about more when we're talking about actual content writing. But I think ideal scenario is that you have somebody in your organization who has bandwidth and who has the time and will be that point person for creating content. Also, at the very outset of the project, you want to plan for long-term content maintenance. If you're creating a digital product, it's going to have content, and it's going to be maintained. Content's going to change. You're going to learn things once the product's out, and you'll need to adjust the content. If you don't plan for that post-launch, if you don't plan it in your budget, you're going to be in a situation where you have a product roll out, and you're going to be like, oh, God, we're getting all these responses that this is too confusing, or this new issue's come up. We really need to create a post, and there's nobody there to manage, maintain, and write new content. Having a general understanding of content before design begins is really helpful for us. And I'll walk through that a bit in the next section about really like how user experience design relates to content. Oftentimes we'll start projects, we'll start design, and the content will change drastically further down the line. And there's a lot of downstream consequences to doing that from a development perspective, from your budget perspective. So I'll go over that. And then create specific content before finalizing designs for any piece of an application. So this is something as simple as what needs to be on a button. If we're talking about, like eviction cases, what are the kinds of buttons? What do they need to say? Because that's going to determine how big a button is, and the size of that button is going to depend on how things are going to scale as we go to mobile and as we come back out. And if we have to change the size of those buttons midway, then we have to often change the entire structure of the application. So these things might seem quite minor, but having a really strong sense of what the content needs to be will really help prevent rework down the line. And then, of course, keep content fresh. I think we have, again, like when we're in the midst of building a project, everybody's got a lot of energy and excitement, and they're dedicating a lot of time and resources into nailing this content. But then once it's out and everybody goes back to their day jobs, the content tends to fizzle, and that's not useful for your users, right? If something changes, they need to know it's changed. If there is a date on when something has been developed, it needs to be on there. And if you're looking back at things and it's 3 years old, then you've really got an issue. You really have got to work on having a long-term sustainability content maintenance plan. So that's more on the logistics side. I'm going to talk now about content design and UX, and this is probably going to be the most nitty-gritty of any of the conversation we're having today, because it is quite specific. So first, I'm going to make an assumption that people in the room generally understand what we're talking about. We're talking about user experience design. If you shake your head violently, if you don't. I see no violence. Okay. So generally, when we're talking about user experience, we're talking about the flow of somebody's process of going through an application. How do they get from point A to point B to get the value of whatever the application is trying to deliver? I think one of my first rules is we need content strategy before we work on IA. IA stands for information architecture, which I will explain to you what that is. Well, let's do that. So this is an example of a site's information architecture. And information architecture, some of you guys might think of it more loosely as like a sitemap. So from the landing page, there are these menu items. The menu items lead them to do these activities, which then leads to this output. This is our starting point from a UX perspective. But we need to understand the strategy from a content perspective in order to even start doing this work. So who are we building it for? This is more like the big picture substantive questions. Who are we building it for, and what's our goal? Because if our goal is to explain to lawyers how to do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to adjust this information architecture to make sure they're getting to X, Y, and Z as quickly as possible. So we need to have that strategy to inform the design of this content. Information architecture. It's not just about sort of what page one's going to do, what page two's going to do. It's really about how are we grouping issues? How do we make a logical flow through the system? It's about naming things and labeling things, which is very, very important when we're talking about users needing to understand what they're doing. If they go to a site and they see something that says, get more information, Well, what does that mean? Are they there to just get content? Are they there to see other resources? We really need to label these things well for users. And I can't stress the importance enough of having good navigation on your site. A lot of the sites that we have in nonprofit space have wacky navigation. Like there's things along the top, there's things down the side, and it's very unclear where somebody's supposed to go if they want to do the one thing they're there to do. So a good sound architecture from the beginning is what helps us get there. And a big part of this is understanding how your users think about the things that you're trying to express on the site. So how do they, if it's a project to help people with landlord-tenant issues, how do they conceive of issues when their heat's off? How do they conceive of issues around eviction? How do we group those things so they make logical sense for your user? And one of the tools we have in design space is a card sorting exercise. Anybody ever heard or done a card sorting exercise? Ooh, look at you guys. Sweet. So this is really, really simple, but the idea is that you bring a bunch of your users into a room, or you can do it one-on-one, or you can do it online. There's a bunch of online tools that will facilitate card sorting exercises and help you evaluate the data that comes out of it. But really it's about, here are the content areas that we think this site's going to be about, the big picture ones. So conditions issues, eviction, security deposit. And then here's a bunch of cards that are like the little pieces, like heat issues, leaky pipes, noisy neighbor, whatever it might be. And then you ask the user to decide what categories these things go in. And I think very much tying into what Shannon was talking about earlier today, as lawyers, we logically put things in buckets. And they're not going to be the same logical buckets that our users put them in. So doing this and getting a better sense of how your users conceive of the content that you're trying to display to them will help inform what your information architecture looks like so that you can make more natural arrangement of information for your users. Following me, everybody? We're good? Okay, great. So content strategy, then information architecture, and card sorting helps inform your information architecture. So these are some steps if you're doing a card sorting exercise. Recruit users, write topics that you expect the site to cover on individual index cards, ask participants to group like content together, and have them talk out loud. If you've ever done any sort of user testing session where somebody's using your product and you say, please talk out loud as you're using it, you get your most valuable information there because they may have a thought process that leads them to put the card in one place, but you might be able to identify that in reality they might need it someplace else. This stuff is 90% psychology, really. And then they can reject cards. If something's completely irrelevant to them and they don't see how it fits in, let them reject it. You'll learn a lot from that. And then you can have predefined groups, but if you're doing something that's quite broad, if you're trying to tackle family law issues, employment issues, landlord-tenant issues all in one product, you might want to let them create the categories because you might see entirely new groupings that you didn't conceive of. So it really depends on sort of the size and scope of the architecture and content of your site. And then content writing before UX. This is what I was mentioning before. The site's UX should be heavily informed by the site's content. So, for example, this is a product that we were working on to help criminal attorneys meet their Padilla obligations. So it's really about immigration-based issues for criminal attorneys who don't otherwise have the ability to do that. So this took a while of us, before we did any wireframes or sketched out anything, we spent a lot of time just moving content around and saying, where do these things that we need to know in order to give them the best advice around the immigration consequences of their client accepting a plea deal, how can we best group those to make logical sense? And here, some of the things had to happen with the client in the room, some things they can do elsewhere. So this represents a substantial amount of effort just to make sure we're grouping things right, which sounds silly, but it's very important. And then we'll also, you can see in the key below here, we identify where there are different steps, what's questions, what question types, what are drop-downs, what are best formulated as date pickers, all of that type of stuff, which is what we bucket into the universe of content. So the question is, what content should I care about? They're going to talk a lot about sort of informational content, but within the context of the site, every single bit of information you give the user is important. So we need to think about them all. And my designer made so much fun of me for these next two slides because she said they look like a crazy person made them, but bear with me. So Obviously, landing page information, I think everybody can sort of generally conceive of that as being important content, right? We generally are trying to create trust with the user, we're trying to explain to them what the value of the product is, and we're trying to show them that what they're doing is not going to be arduous. It's not going to be an arduous process, it's going to be simple, anyone can do it, these types of things. And we need to use the content on the landing page very, very carefully to express those kinds of things. Modals are little square pop-up windows. Those are usually gathering some important information. A modal is usually saying, like, this is something you need to pay attention to, so you need to be focused on what the content is for your modals. Empty states is something we never think about, but if you get to a page and there's no results, how do we tell the user about that? How do we tell them why there are no results? And where do they go next if there are no results? Buttons and categories. This is the kind of thing I was talking about. You know, these are like child issues, insurance claims, rebuilding, that sort of thing. Again, if we don't know how long that content's going to be, we can't build that button. And one more psychotic page, I'm sorry. Tooltips are really important. You know, oftentimes our goal in these justice projects is to have the questions be very, very simple so that somebody can easily conceive of it without additional information. But there's always situations where where additional information is needed, so we have tooltips. That content needs to be very carefully written because you're trying to explain something in as few words as possible. Error messages. So if you do something wrong, the site needs to be very, very intuitive and tell you what you did wrong and guide you to fix that problem. Hover states. If you wave your mouse over a button and something happens, that too is content. And then we generate emails. We always generate emails. That content's important. How are we going to drive attention to actually pay attention to that email and not just immediately delete it? So when you think about content, there is a universe of things that are very, very important, and each one of them is as important as the next to help the overall experience for the user. So, not to freak you out, I mean, there's a lot there. And so from our perspective as developers, the way we handle making sure that the product is not delayed by a lack of content or that there's no rework is that this is our typical sprint cycle, so 2 weeks worth of development. At the end, the last day of development, we have a content deadline for the next sprint. So before we start developing or confirming designs for the things we're going to build in the next 2 weeks, you have a deadline, and you're going to meet it, or else we're going to get mad. So having these like very regular content deadlines and keeping consistent and making sure you are meeting those is going to help keep your project on budget and on time. So why is it important? Why is it important to meet those deadlines? Because uncertain content causes rework. And rework is the enemy of all budgets, right? We want to do everything we can. I mean, it's interesting because we are an agile shop, and I think most of you guys, if you've built custom technology, are used to agile. The concept of agile is that we're always responding to new information. So there's necessarily going to be some amount of rework. But we try to avoid rework where there's obvious things that don't need to be redone later. It just, you know, we can sort of predict timelines, we can predict budgets based on a certain amount of rework that's inherent in agile processes and information we learn, but if it's something completely different and takes you off track, then you have to deal with that. And I have an example of this, and this is rework based on good learnings, though. This was sort of the right kind of change, but I want to show you the consequences. So this is a project that we built in Florida. Our original content strategy was really around, let's give somebody the least amount of information possible so that they can have more of a visual experience, get them right into what they need, and get them moving along. But we knew that some people, like say I'm looking at, I have a guardianship issue. I may need to sort of figure out which category I'm in, so we gave them a hover state. You can see on the right-hand side of the desktop, there's a hover state. And the hover state has more information about what you might find under the money and debt category. So we're giving you the top level information, and we're making it pretty easy to find the next level information without bombarding you with too much content. And you can see how this looked on mobile. One of our tensions, though, is on mobile there is no hover state. You can't wave a cursor over a button on mobile and see more information. So we had a little bit of tension there, and after doing some testing, it was very clear to us that we needed to move to more of a mobile-first presentation with respect to our content. And so while on the desktop application, it's not very desirable to have all of that content written out there, on mobile, it's all there. So there's no hover state, but we give them the information they need. So it creates a more cluttered visual design on the desktop, but vast majority of our users are going to be on mobile, so we're going to give them that layer of information. But if you see the difference in button size to maintain that content, this causes rework, right? So the breaking points are different. As you go down to a mobile screen, when things start sort of going under each other, those are going to be different. So there's a lot of rework that has to happen on the architecture. But this was a very meaningful change in the architecture based on user experience. So the more we can know up front, great, but we also need to be flexible for when content needs change. And a last point that I think will segue into what Hallie's going to talk about is that from a UX perspective, information is best absorbed when content and design both communicate information together. And as a small representation of this, we built this product for senior citizens in Colorado. And so if you've seen products we built, we generally try to do a lot of playful things with our interfaces, make them look more modern so that we draw people in and have them really want to engage. But here with senior citizens as our users, the content strategy was really around familiarity. Like, this needed to be familiar. So the look and feel is very familiar. It's a very standard website design with a banner image at the top, some like, here's what's going to happen next. Very, very easy to sort of intuitively understand for somebody who's not a digital native. And then we also, obviously the content says, this is for Colorado senior citizens. But through imagery this is sort of a rotating carousel of seniors, we sort of continue to give that feeling that this is for you. This is a product that's for you, and it's not for, young bucks. Is that not a thing people say? Young bucks. And so really, like, when those two experiences come together between language and visual design, that's really when we provide the best experience and sort of the most intuitive experience for the users we're building for. All right, on to Hallie. For sure. Yeah, so this was built to be desktop first. Most of the senior users were using either a desktop at home or a desktop at the library. Smartphone usage was less common than it is in most of the populations that we're building for, actually. Oftentimes it's quite opposite. Our users have no desktop at home, but they have access to a smartphone. So this was very much built to be mobile responsive and not mobile first. Yeah.
Thank you. So content visualization is sort of a funny thing because it's so, this one's on. It's so present, but for some reason a lot of people think that they can't participate in it or do it. And so hopefully today I'm going to convince you all that that is not the case, and you can create a lot of amazing visuals to be content and also to emphasize content that you have, because the two are really intertwined. So I engage in what I call visual communication. What does that mean? Well, it's just conveying information using symbols and imagery. And yes, that does include text, and the way that you use text is a form of visual communication. But I would encourage you all to not stay limited to that. I think there's a lot to be said about fonts. I love talking about fonts. We're not going to do that too much today. And hierarchy and size and all of these important things, that's all visual communication. I'm going to recommend a great book for those typography nerds out there who want to actually get into that. But there are so many other tools that we have at our disposal in our advocacy, in creating our content, that maybe we tend not to think of as lawyers. These are just a couple of them. Data visualization, charts to sort of inform numbers or information that might be sort of hard to just look at in its raw form, but is actually super important to the work that we're doing. Illustrations, comics and animation, narrative. Some folks, when they were asked what they were thinking of when they heard content, said videos. That falls in there. We have this power of narrative to tell the stories of the folks that we're working with, and visuals are such a powerful tool for doing that. So, okay. Why are visuals important? There's many, many, many reasons, but I want to focus on sort of two problems that we might encounter in a lot of what we do. And this is specific to trying to convey legal information, but this applies to conveying information to attorneys as well about how to use systems. I mean, this is true for so many kinds of information, for so many kinds of processes that we and our clients and the populations we serve have to deal with. Number one, law is complicated, although of course it doesn't have to be, but the profession has a vested interest in keeping it that way so that lawyers can charge a lot of money for their services. And two, something that maybe we tend to forget about, but you all definitely don't, but folks in the legal world do, that law is personal, law is human. There are real people who are trying to navigate these systems. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about why visuals are sort of uniquely suited at getting at these two problems when we're trying to create content dealing with legal issues. So law is complicated and visuals clarify. There's this psychological phenomenon called the pictorial superiority effect or something like that. Basically what it means is that words and pictures are better than just words alone. We tend to remember them, we engage with them more, and they can really help us to understand concepts. They're also great for breaking language barriers. They're everywhere around us. Every sign that we look at, we're constantly taking in visual cues. And so visuals are a super powerful tool when we're trying to talk about really complex things like, you know, divorce, serving divorce papers, like all this scary stuff. We can use visuals to really break down these concepts and to drive home the important parts for folks. So here's just a little example from a project that I worked on with a great organization called Co-op Dayton out in Ohio. So the left-hand side is just text describing what a cooperative is. This is, you know, a non-exploitative working structure, hopefully. And then the right side, we have a little comic that's saying the exact same thing. And now this is already sort of cheating in favor of the text because this is like fairly short. You know, I put it in a nice font. Like, it doesn't look that bad, right? But I at least am still much more drawn to the right-hand side, and it makes the concept much clearer to me. Instead of hearing about the group of farmers, I'm seeing the farmers interacting. They're talking to me. They're telling me, look, we grew these beans. Here I am in the field with the beans. Here I am with the money, getting the profits. So that's just one example of how visuals can work together with text to clarify things that might otherwise make your eyes just totally glaze over. The second thing, law is personal. Law is something that affects all of us. It is something that is an extreme hurdle for many of the people that we deal with. It is something that can target a lot of people. It is something that can entrench systemic inequalities. There are real costs, human costs, to the ways that the law operates. And visuals humanize and engage, and they mobilize, and they acknowledge the fact that there are actually emotions going on when we engage in these processes. People who are looking at self-help resources are often at very, very difficult points in their lives, facing eviction or intimate partner violence. These are scary things. And on top of all of that, law is scary, and going to court is scary, and interacting with lawyers is terrifying, right? So, I mean, hopefully not. I'm sure you're all very nice people. But this is a frightening situation for a lot of folks. And visuals have this amazing power to humanize the situation, to create empathy with the person using the content, engaging with the content. So just a quick example. This is from a pamphlet about bail bonds that GAP did with Iowa Legal Aid. And so the left-hand side is the text that accompanied the graphic. So this is a case where text and visuals are working together in tandem. But I would argue that if you only had the left-hand side, you're not getting the whole picture, right? So the pamphlet actually followed those three bottom characters throughout their process of being approached by a bail bond agent and trying to navigate their consumer protection rights, dealing with the agent, having to face potential consequences of not paying their bail on time. These are all super scary things, and often surrounded by very complicated procedures that won't necessarily make sense. And to not acknowledge that these are human beings going through these processes is really doing us a disservice, because we can say, look, put yourselves in the shoes of these characters, follow through with us. This is something you can do. You can get through this. We can help you. You can exercise your rights and protect yourself from these fraudulent or bail bond practices in this case. So, whoop. Did my new thing not pop up? Oh no! Well, okay, I'm gonna refresh, because you're not getting out of this. Sorry. I'm just gonna refresh the presentation because I added a little something in. But basically, we're all gonna draw now. Please don't be alarmed. It's going to be fun, and I'm only going to make you do it for a few seconds. Yes, bingo. Where's the presentation button? Help me out here.
Next to the yellow share.
Next to the yellow share. Yeah, there we go. Okay, let's draw. So I came prepared with extra pens and paper. Does anybody need a pen or a little piece of scrap paper, or are you all good? You're all doing this. This is happening. I don't know what it is about drawing, but for some reason everyone decides this when they're 5, that either they can or can't draw. This is ridiculous, right? Like, this is actually something that we can all do. Some of the best stuff that Gap has ever created has been stick figures, and we tested it to see what people prefer, and they love the stick figures. You can all draw a stick figure, I promise. But this is actually going to be more of an exercise in sort of trying to think about how visuals can help you to put yourself in your user's shoes and think about the ways that your user is approaching a problem. And Margaret Hagan, who's also at this conference, really encourages folks to get visual in the design process, even beyond creating visuals that will be a part of the ultimate content. Using that part of our brain helps us to break out into more creative processes. And this is all just to justify what I am going to do to you right now. So let's take 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Here's the prompt. So earlier, Erica asked you all to think about a problem of some content that you're trying to create and the ultimate impact. For those of you for whom that answer works, you can use that. Otherwise, I'll give you an alternative. I want you to think about that situation. So being served with divorce proceedings. That's a great example. How is your target user feeling when confronted with the problem that you're trying to solve? And if that doesn't quite work for your problem, you can take the example of eviction proceedings. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody who has just gotten served eviction proceedings, an eviction notice, and just draw what you think they would be feeling in that moment. Quick and dirty, 90 seconds. I'm going to time it. Don't overthink it. I believe in you all. Follow your dreams, go. Thank you. How did that feel for people? Was that okay? You're all doing okay? I hope it was fun. All right, so what are some of the emotions that you thought your potential user or client might be feeling, if you want to just shout out a few examples? What was that? Panic, fear, confusion, yes. Any others? What's that? Frustration, absolutely. Overwhelmed, negative emotions, right? These are bummers. Okay, how many people drew some sort of representation of a person in their drawing? So this is so interesting, and there's no right answer to this, but that's something so special about visuals, that you can actually create that person, right? It's very hard to do with words, to make a little human that another human can look at and say, oh my goodness, that's me. How many people used a symbol like a rain cloud, or like a sad, we got rain clouds, we got, oh yeah, okay. Other like symbols, a question mark, yeah. Other symbols that folks use, does anyone want to? Dollar sign, courthouse, children. So the point of that is just that we actually already have this visual vocabulary built up. And it varies from user group to user group, but a lot of it is shared across way more boundaries than you might expect. And so this is not actually that much of a science. It's not that scary. This is something that we can do. And if you took that drawing that you just made and stuck it into your content, I think in most cases it would probably improve the content. You could spend a little bit more time on it if you want to, but this is not something that you should shy away from, and even if you're not ultimately going to use things, I think it's so great to visualize stuff for yourself, to put yourself in that mindset. So how can you use visuals in your work when creating your content? And you might say, well, we don't have the resources to hire like a professional, someone like me or like Nicole, or we don't, and I can't do this myself. And I would question both of those premises. I know that a lot of folks, Gap included, do offer services at discounted rates for pro bono folks. And a lot of graphic designers and illustrators out in the world really want to do good, and so are probably willing to do that. So you should look into it. But I really want to question the second premise, that you can't create stuff, because there is so much that you can do on your own without training. And I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of things that I think are really key when you're approaching this process in your content. And maybe you're lucky enough to have someone on staff who's really into this stuff, and that's great. But even if you don't, this is stuff that you can incorporate when you're doing your own work. So user participation and feedback, Nicole just talked about this a lot because it's very, very important. Users are the key to all the content we create. We're making it for them. Hopefully we're making it with them. That's the participation part. We want to get rid of all of our assumptions about what they need. They know what they need. We need to get that information from them. And in the context of visuals, Nicole was talking about how, nail down your content before you get to design. So true. Ideally, that is the way it works. But that doesn't mean that you can't start getting information about what those visuals are going to look like, what your design is going to be like. And I'm speaking specifically about visual design, but of course all design aspects, while you're doing your user participation and feedback. I'll get into that a little bit more. I'm going to do that right now. What are your users thinking and feeling? What are the hurdles that they're facing? And beyond this, what are their language needs? What are their access points? What are their shared visual vocabularies, right? Like, one really interesting example is like in Japanese manga, they use like totally different symbols than we do. So like a nosebleed means lust, which we might not necessarily here know. So the stuff like that, we do have a lot of shared visual vocabulary, but like check in with your users. Your users know this best. Who are your users and how do you represent them in the work that you're doing? This is an excerpt from one of my very favorite books of all time, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, just talking about how the less realistic and less specific you get in a representation of a human face, the more people you're actually representing. And this is a principle that Erica and I used in this project to help folks navigate financial distress. This is Blob. Blob is a little bit of a celebrity in the A to J world. Some of you might have seen Blob before. And Blob is meant to be sort of a genderless, raceless, ageless, but still very personable and, if not human-like character who's navigating these proceedings. You can see some other blobs here who do have more specific characteristics, like the judge and the scary man in the top hat, who we refer to as Fat Cat. But Blob here is the protagonist, and Blob doesn't have those characteristics. And the idea behind that is so that anyone using this can hopefully relate to Blob, put themselves in Blob's shoes, and follow along with Blob as Blob goes to court to challenge debt collection proceedings that have been filed against Blob. But sometimes you want to very specifically represent certain groups. This is from a project with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund about voting rights in, I believe this was Texas. And this was specifically geared at communities of color, Black folks and Latino folks in Texas. And the LDF thought it was really important to represent those people in this visual. So sometimes you do want to do that as well. It would have been even better for us to go out there and to get a sense of what folks, what users on the ground needed and wanted from this resource, and that's something we're working on and that I hope all of you will consider doing as you create your content too. Okay, the second thing on that list before was using common visual patterns, and I'm just gonna blast through these really quickly, but these are things that are maybe quite simple to use. Tables. It's just organizing words. This is visual communication. It can make things much clearer, much more simple than a wall of text. Flowcharts. If you have a process where people sort of have to make decisions based on prior decisions, this can be a super useful thing. You do not need to draw for it. I had a lot of fun with this one, but it's also a little bit insane and arguably would be better without all of those crazy cartoons. So does not need all of that. Similar roadmaps, taking somebody from point A to point B, the steps along the way. Giving some sort of visual representation of what they're going through in each process, but really just laying something out in a visual pattern so that folks can see how different processes connect. Icon sets. Simple representations that can be repeated throughout a resource, and you can see this in Nicole's work that she shared with us. So an envelope for notice, and this appeared on several pages in this toolkit so that hopefully every time the user saw that envelope, they were like, oh right, this is notice, I've seen this before, I know what this means, this is the information I'm looking for right now, or this isn't the information I'm looking for right now. And finally, and this is the more complicated one, but comics and visual narratives. And I am an illustrator, so I draw this stuff, but you can also you can take photos. You can take photos of your coworkers, you can act stuff out, you can draw stick figures. Don't use clip art, try not to use clip art, but if you must, there's some better clip art sets out there. But you can find where, you can draw a little, like a circle and a square, and those are your protagonists, and they have little word bubbles, right? These are all ways to tell a story with visuals in your content. And then the final thing is sort of putting this all together using basic principles of visual design. And 3 of these, although there are many, are typography, color, and composition. And all 3 of these are used on this very slide. This slide is based on a template that Nicole created. Thank you so much. It's beautiful. I love the pink. So we have typography. We have made some font choices. The font is quite large so that you all can hopefully see it. I've highlighted certain things to make them stand out a bit more. Color, pink, it's exciting, it's morning, it's the first day of the conference, we're so excited to be here. This is an energizing color, hopefully. I've used pink to sort of bring out different textual elements to draw your eye. And then finally, composition. This is about the flow on the page. So right now we have a sort of bifurcated page. On the one side, we have the question. On the other side, we have the answer. Hopefully, the flow is very clear. And you can get into all this stuff so much more. I've got a couple resources up there that you should take a look at. Typography for Lawyers is the book I was mentioning before. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's really great. Lie by Design by Margaret Hagan, who's here, is kind of like an ongoing work in progress for folks who are interested in this stuff more. Convivial Toolbox is sort of about creativity in the design process, iterative design process at large, so this really applies to everything that we're all talking about. But it's such a great book, and it really does question the idea that only certain people can be creative. And then Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, Making Comics by Linda Berry. Just if you like comics, check them out. And then I have one request that's very relevant to what we're doing today, aka getting feedback from your target audience when you're creating content. Because GAP is trying to design resources for you, people in the A to J space who might be looking to incorporate visual content into whatever it is that you're doing. We're trying to make resources to make that easier for you, like free templates and design guides and all that cool stuff. And so I'm sorry that this link is so large, but if you take a photo of it and you go to it, it'll just ask you to put your email address in, and I will email you some point with a survey to ask you more questions, but that would be so amazing to get your input for that. And now I am going to turn it over to Jay to talk about plain language.
All right, hi everyone. This is the most beautiful slide deck I've ever been a part of. I have to admit that I did sully it with some clip art. I apologize. I hadn't sat through the presentation yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual writing when you're trying to convey information in writing, hopefully accompanied by images as well. And focusing on plain language and making sure that the way you're communicating is in a way that folks can understand. So I'm going to start with kind of the why. I think that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but in case there are folks in your organizations that you're working with who are questioning why plain language matters, I think it's important to be able to illustrate just like how key this is. This is a photograph of an emergency exit sign that one of my coworkers took while she was waiting in a hospital while her son was getting ACL surgery. If you can't read it, it says accessible means of egress with a very complicated map, which clearly would be immensely helpful if there was in fact like a fire or something and you were in a panic trying to figure out where to go. I barely know what that means. I can't follow the map. Anyway, just a simple story to illustrate how important it is that we think about the way that we're communicating things, and also think about our user and what kind of a situation, what kind of emotions they're feeling when they're working through the content that you're presenting. So I know that in my organization, in the past, there's been some pushback on plain language, particularly when we've talked about it in terms of low literacy, which I think we've really moved towards plain language, where some folks might say, you know, that's a little demeaning to clients to say that they need to read something at a 5th grade level. You know, our clients are very intelligent. And we all know this, but I think it's helpful to frame that not in terms of your client's intelligence level, but where they're coming from. You know, when they're looking at your content, they're often coming to you in a very stressful situation. They're in an unfamiliar, navigating an unfamiliar system. A lot of times English might not be their first language, and there are just so many other barriers that folks might be facing. And just to illustrate with another story that I'm borrowing from my coworker, he usually talks a lot about plain language. She had a situation several years ago where she had been visiting the country where her son was born, and when she tried to leave the country, they wouldn't let him leave because they didn't have the proper paperwork from her son's father, who was MIA, so they weren't going to get the paperwork, the sign off from him. And so my coworker had to leave her son with some friends there in this other country, and then tried to navigate the bureaucracy of this country from the United States. So she's in a super stressful situation. She's trying to get her son back. She is speaking in a language that she's fluent in, but that isn't her first language. She worked at Legal Aid, so she's incredibly bright, really smart, used to navigating complex situations. But still, it wasn't until she got somebody on the phone who really walked her through step by step the process that she needed to go through to get the right paperwork, that she was able to figure out how to get her son back to the United States with her. And that involved steps like go to this building, go up the stairs 1 floor, turn right, go to the room on the second door on your left. So to that level of detail, and then ask for this specific piece of paperwork. So that level of detail is what we need to be thinking about when we're trying to figure out how to communicate these really complex situations that are often for people in very stressful situations, to really think through, if we're in that situation, what is the information that we need? So I know that you all already know this, but in case any of those stories are useful, please feel free to use them as you're trying to spread the word. So I'm just going to go through some of the very basics that we think about in my office when we're making sure that our content is written in an understandable and plain language way. So the first thing is thinking about your organization. Very simple things. Is your title communicating what that piece of information is about? Are you using headings? Are you breaking down the steps of a process using bullet points or numbered lists, so that it's very simple to follow and simple to know what do I do first and then what do I do next? If you're telling someone, for example, to provide proof that they have a low income, are you explaining what that means exactly? Are you saying provide proof of your income? That could be things like a copy of your pay stub, a copy of your benefits card. Things like that, really breaking it down and not making assumptions about what folks might already know, or that folks might know what a particular phrase means. Other things to think about, and again, this is really back to the basics, but good to keep front of mind. Make sure that you're keeping everything short. Breaking things up into separate paragraphs can be very helpful rather than a wall of text. And that might result in the end product being longer, but if it's still broken into simple chunks, then that's easier to read. And also if you're thinking about the overall presentation where you have white space paired with text, so that it's not just so overwhelming to see all those words together. think about using positive statements. So rather than stating things in the negative, saying you need to provide proof of your income rather than the negative version of that. And this is really just more specifics of that, but try to make sure that each sentence has a single thought. Keep your sentences to 25 words or less. That's what our office tries to shoot for. Paragraphs to 60 words or less. And then finally, as you're workshopping something, first of all, make sure that you're talking with someone. Read out loud what you're saying, what you're writing down, to make sure that it makes sense once you're actually saying it out loud. In our office, if we're trying to translate something that a lawyer has written into something that will make sense to the broader public, we'll often just like have a quick hallway conference with 3 of us and just try conveying what we're trying to say in different ways just by speaking it out loud. And usually that does the trick to get something that makes a little bit more sense. We also keep this chart around. We have, I think, an expanded version as well, but just of phrases to avoid and then what to substitute them with. I think, so how many of you all have like been to law school and had that training? So we learn a lot of really big words. So that's hard for me to cut out sometimes. So I usually will just like write what I'm trying to say down in the way that comes naturally to me, and then go back through with a checklist that I'm going to give you all at the end of this talk, and cross out all of the things that I've done wrong if I'm trying to write in plain language. And one of those things is using a chart like this to find any phrases that I've used where I can eliminate them in favor of one word. And I won't get into this too much, but because I think that our other presenters have talked about this, but think about how the information is being presented. So a lot of Minnesota's statewide website is focused on fact sheets, which are short explanations of common legal issues. And we have both HTML versions of that as well as PDF versions, because a lot of our partner legal aid organizations use the paper versions when they're sending out advice letters or doing outreach events. So we think about design in terms of both, how does this look on our website, where here you can see that we've got headings broken up into accordions, and that kind of serves as a outline that you can look at very quickly to know what are the topics covered in this. Whereas when you look at it in the PDF version, where this would be like a printed version you would give to someone, that looks very different. And we do a lot more with using images and things to break up content and visually convey what we're trying to say. So I think that you all are really smart people, and so you can do the plain language part, but I think what's harder is devoting the resources to that and making sure that it's a priority in your offices. So I wanted to spend a moment talking about that as well, and sharing what we do in Minnesota. I think that there's always room for improvement, so this is just like one idea to throw out there. But I think it's really important to develop your own plain language experts within your organizations. I was talking to Angela Tripp from Michigan yesterday, and she was talking about a lot of the work that we do trying to help people navigate processes on their own, and developing self-help resources is not anything that's taught anywhere. So we really have to develop that expertise within our own organizations, because we're not going to get it elsewhere other than conferences like this. So I think it's really important to make sure that you have one or more people on your staff where being a plain language expert and making sure that content is written in a readable way is like literally a part of their job description, so that it is and remains a priority within your organization. And I think that's true not just for statewide websites like LawHelp, but it's also true for your attorneys who are writing client letters or other staff who are writing client letters. These concepts apply across the board, where anytime we're doing something in writing, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that can be understood. So in our office, in terms of, this is my attempt at doing a cartoon. And I have 2 pieces of clip art. I'm sorry. So we have, for all of our fact sheets and other legal content, we have subject matter experts at our partner, generally at our partner legal aid organizations, sometimes volunteer attorneys as well, do the first draft. And they put down, these are the legal rights, these are the legal processes. Then that comes to the person in our office who is our plain language expert, and I literally think of it as translating. She translates it into plain language. And I want to talk about the tension, too, that can be there, because as lawyers, we all know that there are nuances to certain words and the way that we use them. And we often have, pretty good conversations with our attorney authors about whether or not we need to keep certain words. And it's a really hard balancing act. And for every situation, you're just going to have to have that conversation with the end user in mind, and thinking about, if we use that very nuanced word, does it matter? Will the end user actually know what that nuance is and know what that means? And can we use different words that maybe don't capture all of the nuance that we learned in law school, that will do a better job of communicating what the rights are in that particular situation? So once our office has come to an agreement about what the plain language version of that fact sheet should be, we don't just leave it there. Every year, we do a review. So we do a legal review where we have a subject matter expert look at the content, and then it comes back to Elsa, who's our plain language person. We like to call her the fact sheet queen. And she looks at it again to make sure that any of the legal changes that have been made are still plain language. But she also takes another look at the first time she did that, that plain language translation. Does it still make sense? Because every year she finds things that she could write more clearly. She realizes, oh, hey, why did I organize it like this? Maybe it makes sense to put this information at the top, because people really need to know that before they move on to the more detailed information in the fact sheet. So that's just to say that just like website development or anything else, I think that plain language should be a very iterative process, and especially as you're developing that expertise within your staff, you're going to continue to learn about what is the best way to communicate information. And then some more cartoon drawing. I think it's important to really to teach others in your organizations, especially your lawyers who are, I really think about this in terms of closing letters to clients or brief advice letters where you're sending out letters to clients. So not just website stuff, to make sure that everybody in your organization is on board with plain language, and has the tools to, has that checklist to go through their letter and make sure that it makes sense, and make sure that they're getting rid of all of the legalese. So we've done a lot of webinars with folks in our organization to try to help attorneys and other staff who are communicating and writing make sure that they're using plain language best practices. How are we on time? Okay. So this is the checklist that you can use. This is uploaded onto the Sketch app. If you go to the session, you can download it. And then if you look at the slides, you can also click on this link, and it'll take you to a download of the checklist. So I encourage you to share it, adapt it for your own purposes. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
And Hallie's just announced that she's going to put her survey link on the Sketch app too when we figure out how to do that. So, all right, so you've thought about your goals, you've thought about your target audience, you figured out that your format that you're going to use is definitely going to include visuals, definitely going to include plain language. You've done some card sorting, participatory work, and figured out what your information architecture is. You're ready to go. Great, good job. That was really quick. What you want to do next is figure out, did you achieve your desired outcome? So I'm going to talk about just one piece of content assessment. So some of the stuff that comes more intuitively to folks is, can people find the information that you're trying to give them? And are they using it, right? A lot of folks are measuring clicks and how long people are staying on their sites, or whether they're getting undeliverable mail back if they're sending things out in the mail. But the ones that are a little bit thornier are the ones that I'm going to talk about the most. But first, if you're interested in figuring out kind of how to map and how to quantify the first few items on this content assessment, I recommend taking a look at the Drake equation. Joyce Raby and Laura Quinn with a lot of other folks, I think some folks in the room here, put together this idea of how to quantify, like, who are you trying to reach, how many people are using this information, are they acting upon it, and what's happening. The Self-Represented Litigation Network, SRLN, is hosting the report and the webinar that they did about this. But some of the thornier things here are, do people act on the information that you give them? And the Ohio Access to Justice Foundation is doing one kind of proxy for that, which is doing a test to see whether people report that they intend to act on the information that they've received. So that's one kind of starting point for that. But this is, so I'm happy to share the results of that information, especially if you're trying to compare different formats or different styles of content. Which kinds of content are either more comprehensible for people, or more importantly, encouraging people to act on the information, giving them a sense of empowerment to act. And I'm going to blow by this one. We're going to come back to it later. But what I'm really interested in talking about is the title of this entire presentation, which is, what do we mean by useful? So I really like the way that SRLN describes this, is like, you want to give people legal help they need, when they need it, in a format that they can use. So I'm kind of describing that as relevant information that's timely for them, and that's actionable or deployable. And if folks are interested in this concept of like what's actionable or deployable really mean, there's another session called Self-Help Reimagined that I encourage folks to go attend. But I'll give you kind of my quick kind of proxy for what I think actionable means. So you can measure whether people act on information, but whether it's actually actionable is a little bit different. So I'm going to give you a non-legal example, which is peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So have you guys seen these YouTube videos of a kid writes instructions for how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and an adult follows the instructions? So they found the information, right? They did find it. They did use the information. The adult is reading the instructions, and they did act on the information. They followed the instructions to put together a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But the information was not exactly actionable, meaning that they didn't actually result in the outcome that they intended to achieve. So I think that what we want to do is make sure that not only do we have information, but is the information resulting in the outcome that we're hoping that will result in. So I picked on a poor attendee here earlier when talking about what the goals are of debt collection content. So knowing your rights is a really important part of a lot of the content that we develop. But I wanted to encourage folks to think more bold about what the precise outcomes are that you're expecting people to do with that information, and then find out if it's actually happening. So one example is the Volunteer Lawyers Project in Boston discovered that they have this weekly volunteer lawyers program where there are people waiting to represent you for free in responding to a debt collection lawsuit. 5 lawyers are sitting there. They could serve probably 10 to 15 clients in a given day. Maybe 2 clients are showing up. Nobody's coming to their debt collection cases. So they put together some information with the help of the Graphic Advocacy Project, including our friend Blob, and sent out letters to people to encourage them to come to court. But they didn't just send out letters. They did this in a randomized controlled trial. So the control group got the status quo, the same thing as they did the day before, which is nothing. One group received a letter with a helpful cartoon from Blob explaining to them that they could come to court, that they could file an answer to respond to their lawsuit, and then B, come to court and see a free lawyer. And then there was a third group that also got a self-addressed stamped envelope to help them send the answer letters back. So they measured it. They found out, like, if we send out these letters, does it make a difference? Can we give people information in a way that they can understand and act on to show up to court? And what they found was that it doubled the answer rate. It doubled the rate at which people actually submitted their answers, and it also doubled their appearance rate in court. Now, it's only making a little dent because the original default rate here was 85%, so nobody was coming to court, right? But you were able to measurably move the needle as a result of your self-help content to encourage people to take the steps that they needed to take to respond to lawsuits and, in a lot of cases, address some real predatory practices by debt collectors. So I just want to encourage people to think about is there some actual outcome as a result of all of this hard work that we've been talking about all session that you could assess to make sure that you're actually improving people's lives as a result of the work that you're doing? And that's it. So good luck. I think, how much time we have now? And we're right on time. So I think we'll hang out up here if people have questions. I don't think if there's somebody who has like one question that you think is super universal that everybody here is going to care about, that guy is really convinced. No? Yeah, go for it. So are we maybe going rogue by being at an innovations and technology conference and encouraging people to write stick figures on their like pads of paper? I'll turn it over to you guys. Can a machine do it? No.
Well, I think the computers are only as smart as the humans, right? So I think that the ultimate content has to start with the humans, and I think that where the AI can come in is getting people to the content. That's kind of how I think about it, at least, is that we can use AI to figure out what are people searching for, what are the search terms, and then what are they actually looking for to train the machine to get it to the content. But I think there's still the human element where somebody has to create the knowledge that exists for the machine to work with. So I think that the technology can build on what we create, and you can certainly integrate it, but I think that at the very heart of it, it has to come from the people, because they're just machines. We have to teach them. That's my answer. Yeah.
I don't know a ton about AI, and I do think it's very cool and could probably do a lot of things that I do. But I think about sort of the importance of building relationships in the communities that we work in, which is something that I don't think AI is ever going to stand in for. I participated in this user research survey. It was about creating resources for folks who are interacting with immigration law enforcement. We were trying to get their stories about times when they had interacted with law enforcement. We were trying to create something for them to help make that very stressful situation easier. We all got together in a community space that they were familiar with. The session was held in the native language of the participants. We had tacos. We had a lovely time. We all chatted. It was extremely moving and scary and terrifying and lovely, and I just don't see how something could be created from a computer asking those questions in the same way as actually meeting those people and trying to deeply understand where they're coming from. But maybe the computer could draw the stuff after, if you could input all of that. I don't know, that'd be kind of cool. But I have seen Google try to identify sheep in a photo, and I don't think we're quite there yet, so maybe eventually. Other questions?
One more.
What are your top do's and don'ts for content if we had to leave or get a takeaway from today? I know everyone has something that they love or hate.
I mean, mine are going to be very different because mine are really about content planning. So the only reason projects are delayed is not because of the technology, it's always because of the content. So plan early, have the right people involved.
Me? Oh my goodness. Do what I just said and actually get out and talk to folks and have that drive your content and be the center of everything that you create and your assessments. I would say don't use clip art, but I actually think that Jay has proven me wrong on that point. Choose your clip art wisely, and you'll do great.
Pair it with stick figures. I think do devote the time and the resources to developing really quality content, and then I think building on what you said, Hallie, user testing, talking to people, making sure that it's actually responsive and resonating with people, which I think you can always do more of.
And I think have a long-term and precise impact that you're intending to create as a result of your content, and then test it. And now we have to go to lunch. Thanks, everybody.